I'm not a professional writer, novelist, or author in any way, shape, or form. This novelization may contain grammatical errors and dialogue inconsistencies that conflict with the original source material. I'm also not a professional voice actor or reading specialist. I did the best I could and kept the best takes, so this is really just for the enjoyment of fans of the original source material and curious people. This work is technically classified as fan fiction and greatly expands upon the original source material. Please enjoy and support the official release. A novelization of Final Fantasy, fan-written and narrated by the RPG Guy. Chapter 1: The King's Summons. "Father, he's wounded!" shouted the soft yet delicate voice of a young woman. She looked over towards the door of what was the interior of a small home made of stone rocks with a floor made of evenly spaced wooden beams. An oil lantern hung down from the ceiling as some natural light came through two small glass windows mounted on the two opposing walls of the small domicile. Two single beds rest in the left corner of the room side by side, and a small stove could be seen across the room against the wall near one of the windows. "I know, Floe. Can you come help me with him?" her father replied, as he was helping a man who hobbled along the floorboards of the home, his arm flung over her father's shoulder as he was screaming in pain. Floe hurried over towards the door as she knocked a staff resting against the wall into the ground, bumping into it with her hip as she moved under the man's other arm and shoulder to help him hobble to the bed on the other side of the single-roomed house. "This is Mr. Dorter. What happened to him?" asks Floe as she leans forward to help him sit down on the bed. Mr. Dorter was sweating profusely, his body wet through his tunic and his arm hairs drenched. The lightly bearded man's eyes had rolled back in his head as the veins visible on his face and arms seemed near black under his skin. He was wincing constantly in pain, though sitting down seemed to ease him a bit more, his body breathing heavily. "I guess the fool was fishing out by the river again, and a damn Ochu must have stung him," her father replies as he begins to examine Mr. Dorter's legs, quickly patting about looking for a breach on his pants or a wound. He finds a hole on his left pant leg, ripped open and thrashed. Blood and a sticky forest green goo slathered across a gaping hole in his leg. "You're going to be all right, Mr. Dorter. Just relax and remain calm," Floe says as she looks down towards her father, noticing him stroking his tiny white beard, while his other hand keeps the hole of the pant leg open, revealing the wound to his daughter. "Looks like it was a small one, but the poison seems to be pretty bad. The wound looks like it's only a few hours old," Flo's father says, his eyes looking above his tiny spectacles up towards Mr. Dorter sitting on the bed, barely able to keep himself upright. "Father, help me lay him down and get my shears if you would," Floe says as she puts an arm on Mr. Dorter's upper chest to slowly push him back onto the bed. Her father carefully grabs Mr. Dorter's legs and lifts them up onto the bed as he moves away across the room to a set of drawers against the wall near the stove. After a few seconds of digging through a drawer filled with rolls of white and red spools of thread, he finds the steel shears and quickly comes back to Flo's side, handing her the shears handle first. Floe quickly moves to the pant leg with the wound and hole in it and begins to cut back the burlap material Mr. Dorter's pants were made from to more fully expose the wound. Floe took a much closer look, her eyes falling upon the wound to see that it was not as bad as it looked, just bleeding uncontrollably from small pin-sized holes in a circular cluster on his leg, no larger than the size of a small oatcake that one would feed to a pony. The green slime surrounding the wound, however, was problematic. She looked at her father with a reassuring smile peeking out from behind a white hood. "He won't stop bleeding until the poison patch is removed. Ochu poisoning is painful and it will prevent the blood from clotting. So if you would get some bandages together while I take care of the poisoning?" Floe asks her father as she tries to keep him calm. Her father nods and goes back to where he had found the shears, digging through the drawers. Floe put her right hand on top of Mr. Dorter's forehead. A high fever was more than obvious to the touch. With her left hand she reached out towards the wound, her palm open only slightly above the ooze-covered wound. Her lips begin to move, ever so slightly, as a soft green light radiates from her palm. It was within a few moments the ooze itself began to harden, losing its slimy texture, as it also lost its dark green color. Soon after the green light from Flo's hand dimmed away, the wound stopped bleeding, but a cast of hardened slime covered where the wound was. Mr. Dorter suddenly stopped screaming in pain, as if it was in that moment. His breathing slowed, and the black veins along his face, arms, and now exposed leg began to return to their normal color. "This is going to hurt, Mr. Dorter, so take a deep breath," Flo says as she places her hand against the hardened slime on his leg. She digs her nails deep into the edge between his exposed skin and the hardened slime. She then pulled up on the hardened slime as hard as she could with her left hand, her right hand suddenly leaping from his forehead to his mouth to mute the scream he blasted out. She tore off the rest of the hardened slime in one rip as he started to bleed a little from the puncture wounds on his leg. She lifted her palm from his mouth as soon as he stopped screaming and slowly turned towards her father, who was there with the bandages. "Looks like you did it, Flo. I'll bandage up his leg while you dispose of that," her father says with a small smirk on his face as he moves towards Mr. Dorter and begins to wrap his wounded leg. Flo smiled as she turned back towards Mr. Dorter, and then looking towards the hardened slime in her hand. It felt like vinyl against her fingers and smelled of sour milk. Just looking at it made her hold her breath as she made her way out the front door and into the light of the sun. It was a beautiful day out, and the wind blew back her white hood, revealing her flowing brown hair. Her soft blue eyes sparkled a bit, as a small mole could be seen on her left cheek. Her skin was soft, and her cute button nose wiggled a bit, as she could still smell the crystallized slime in her hand. She wore a soft white robe that covered her from head to toe. The triangular red trim along the lapels of the sleeves and along the lapels surrounding the bottom of the robe and the hood stood out vibrantly in contrast to the clean white robe. The robe was held closed by a leather belt with 3 small black leather pouches dangling from it on her left side, and she had on a small set of brown leather shoes with hardened, firm soles. As she looked out upon the horizon, she could see a cluster of buildings and houses with small chimneys darting out from the tops of them. To each side of the town center, the hills were covered with small homes, much more spread out, and beyond the town center and the hills of houses, a river encompassing it all, except for a small dirt road far to the east with small patches of grass and dirt holding back the water on both sides. Further to the east, she could see clouds incapable of covering what looked to be a massive singular mountain off in the distance, the peak reaching above the clouds and the base covered by a small range of stubby, rocky mountains. Flo took in a deep breath of fresh air as her eyes caught the sight of what looked like a fisherman hurrying his way along a small dirt road. His arms were waving high above him as his barely audible voice called out. Flo's head slowly began to shift slightly to the right, as she seemed perplexed by yet another visitor who was nearly falling over himself as he ran along the road. Her father could be heard making his way out from their home as he put his arm on Flo's shoulder. "Mr. Dorter will be fine, thanks to you, my little plum," he says, grinning brightly through his snowy white beard. "Knock it off, father. I'm not your little plum anymore," Flo says, not taking her eyes off the fisherman, though sounding agitated by the comment. "You'll always be my... Is that Alistair? If it is about his canoe again, I just fixed it, the simpleton," he says, chuckling a bit as he stood seeing the man run towards them. Flo's father pats her on the back as he starts to walk towards the direction of Alistair. Flo took the hardened slime in her hand and tossed it out into the tall grass across the dirt road leading into her home. She could see her father and Alistair talking for a bit, and then her father taking a letter from him as Alistair scurries off, back the way he came. Her father slowly made his way back towards Flo as he had opened the letter and was reading it, his eyes sliding up from the letter once in a while as he walked. "Let me guess, he wants you to fix his canoe," Flo says, giggling a bit as she tries to see the expression on her father's face. "Yes and no. As much as it would make me happy to tease him about punching holes in his canoe, this time it was for good reason," her father says, the look on his face seeming puzzled and mildly concerned. "Come, father, can't be that important, could it? Floe asks in confusion, seeing her father's concerned expression.
Well, little Plum, this is a letter from the King of Cornelia. He requests that I come to the castle and speak with him. How peculiar.
Flo's father's voice trails off as he continues to read. What does the King of Cornelia want to ask you about? Why not ask for Lucan? He is the master of the Circle of Sages. Floe says with a light chuckle in her voice.
Well, I would assume that I was requested not because I know less than Lucan, but because I specialize in our world's myths and legends, as well as our world's history. Did I ever tell you the story about the Sky People who founded a town nearly 4,000 years ago?
Her father says as he starts to ramble. Father, I have heard that story so many times it would make me fall asleep on my feet. Yet, they requested you. But the Finnish gathering is in a few weeks. You can't go to Cornelia and get back to Crescent Lake before then. And the other sages cannot start their debates without you. Floe says as she grabs the letter from her father and quickly begins to read it herself.
This is very true indeed. It would be another decade before another gathering would take place, and this letter states that this is of the utmost importance.
Flo's father replies as he looks towards the ground, seeming to be lost in thought. Father, what does it mean by bring the crystal? Floe asks as she folds the letter in half and looks back at him blankly.
Well, something must have happened. What it could be about, I can't possibly know.
He pauses for a moment, pulling softly on his white beard, and then he smiles, looking up at his daughter.
You know, little Plum, I have taught you everything I know in hopes that you'd replace me in the circle someday. I am too old to be traveling upriver that far, and I cannot miss the gathering. Perhaps it is time for you to represent the circle and deal with this problem yourself,
he says, taking Flo's free left hand. Father, I really think you should be the one to go to the king. He knows you, and, he requested for you specifically. Would it not be rude to send your daughter in place of the great sage Denali? Floe says, with utter concern on her face.
The great sage is old and his bones are tired. I have been traveling the world for almost 40 years now. There comes a time in one's life where even the summons of a king cannot instill enough spirit and energy in a body ravaged by years of travel and old age. Isn't this what you always wanted? To leave this quiet hovel?
He says softly, pleading with his daughter. I just don't think it's safe. Mr. Dorder was attacked by river monsters today, and I don't know the way. This is a lot to take in. Floe says as she pulls her arm away from her father and looks out on the narrow lake nearly surrounding the city.
You asked about the crystal?
Her father says as he reaches into a small pouch strapped to his waist belt. He pulls out a dark crystal void of color and no longer showing a single gleam or sparkle as he takes back Flo's hand and puts the crystal in her palm.
This is something your mother gave me.
Mother gave you this? Floe asks, examining the crystal closely as she held it up to the sun to see only a hint of light shining through it, giving the crystal a dark bluish hue.
She did, little Plum. It was something she wanted me to look after for her when she left us. Something she brought with her from across the sea when I found her washed up on our coast almost 25 years ago.
He says, trying to hold back a sniffle as he keeps his eyes fixed on Floe. Mother's crystal? What is it? Floe asks her father as her eyes begin to water, looking down at the crystal in her hand.
Your mother once said it was magical and was given to her by a mermaid. I have kept it all this time for her, in secret, except for a few people I trust.
He replies, smiling and looking down at the crystal with her. Why would the king want you to bring this to Cornelia? Floe asks, her eyes returning to her father.
That there is a good question, little Plum. A question I could only speculate on. Perhaps he knows something about it that I don't. Regardless, he wouldn't summon me with it for no reason whatsoever. The king is trustworthy, and he would not interrupt our intellectual gathering unless it was truly important.
her father replies, patting her on the back. You sure it's a good idea for me to take this on such a long journey? Floe asks as she looks back at the crystal curiously.
Your mother taught you in the magical arts of healing. You are young and full of energy. The world is a vast place, and I would want my daughter to begin to see it for herself before I die. I mean, seeing the world is far more interesting than reading about it in a book. I trust you to carry my mantle of knowledge, and it is about time you set off to find what you want in this world.
He replies, smiling brightly at the thought of her daughter finding happiness and seeing the world as he did when he was young. But father... Floe couldn't respond. She wanted to see the world more than anything, but it seemed like so much responsibility being thrusted upon her. Thoughts of her mother ran through her head as she gripped the center of her chest. Pulling on her robe, a few tears flowed from her eyes.
Come now, little Plum, no need for tears. I know this is a lot to process. Why don't we go inside and check on Mr. Daughter and have us some tea? I'll make you some delicious sugar cakes with the sweet birch syrup you like, and we can discuss the specifics of what is to come.
He says happily with a small smile growing on his face. Yeah, I'd like some tea and sugar cakes, Floe says as she tries to smile past her tears. She felt so awkward to be tearing up over something so strange and so seemingly hard to comprehend. It was unlike her to fret over a challenge or worry about going too far upriver from the lake. It's not like she had not done it before. It just seemed so surreal to her to have something like this happen so suddenly. Her father went into the house, and he left her to think for a moment. So many thoughts and feelings flowed through her, and she was struggling to separate them all. It hit her like a ton of bricks on how simple and easy it was for her father to just tell her to go and do this important task for him. Yet, as she grasped the crystal in her hand, she swore she could hear the soft humming of her mother as a subtle warmth slowly surrounded her body. She sniffled a bit and turned back towards her home, quickly wipes the tears away from her eyes, and makes her way back into the house. There was a thick fog covering all of Crescent Lake at the early hours of the morning. The light chirping of birds could be heard in the overcast sky as the sound of small frogs croaked along the lakeside. The splashes of the calm lake water could be heard as clear as day as Floe and her father Denali, with a satchel in his arms, stood at the mouth of the river that connects to the tip of Crescent Lake. Alistair was there next to a well-kept canoe made from hard wood with 2 oars leaning against its side near the lake's edge, parked slightly away from the mouth of the river.
I have packed foodstuffs and some other supplies for you. I am letting Alistair borrow my canoe for this trek,
Denali says as he takes the strap and tosses it over Flo's head and shoulder. Is this the last time I will ever see you again? Floe says, still seeming mildly concerned about the task requested of her.
Of course not, little Plum. This is just your first big adventure on your own. Remember how important you are to not just me, but to the world you're about to enter.
Her father replies, smiling brightly at her. Now you're just being silly, Floe says as she rolls her eyes at him and playfully in response.
Really, I mean it. You're a good girl, and down that river is the rest of the world. Your mother and I have taught you everything we know, and honestly, I could not prepare you any more than you are now. It's time for you to pick up where I left off,
Denali says, putting his left hand on her shoulder. Thank you, Father. I won't let you down, Floe says, looking down towards the ground, trying to hide her nervous smile.
Never even considered the thought that you would, little Plum,
Denali says, crossing his arms as he looks his daughter up and down, as if committing the way she is now to memory. Though upon crossing his arms, he pats a hardened area near his chest, then reaches into his coat, pulling out a large wooden hammer.
Before you leave, I want to give this to you,
he quickly adds. This is your prized master's gavel, Floe says in surprise, considering how well he hid it in his coat, as the gavel head itself was the length of his forearm alone.
Indeed it is. I've not just used it to silence the sages, but to defend myself from their physical outbursts.
he says, chuckling a bit as he hands the wooden hammer over to her. I can't take this, Father. It's too special, Floe says as she leans a bit back from the offering.
Little Plum, you can't fend off the monsters and brigands of the world with just your bare fists. This is the only real weapon I have to give you. Please take it,
Denali says, pushing the hammer into her right hand. Though the hammer was heavy, it was solid and stubby enough to feel as if she could control it. At the end of the shaft was a leather strap that she could slide her wrist into to help make it more wieldy. She looked down at the dark wooden hammer, admiring the beautiful grain and designs on it. Though the design itself was very simple, but it was still aesthetically pleasing. She looks back at her father with a more worried expression. What would happen if I were to lose it? She replies to him with a smirk on her face.
Then you lose it. As long as it keeps you safe, that's all that matters. I mean, come now, it's just a wooden hammer.
He says, chuckling playfully. I love you, Father, Floe says, moving towards him, and with her free arm she holds her father close. Denali did not respond, but put both of his arms around her as he let out a rough, compassionate sigh. Flo's face nuzzled in her father's chest as they were silent for a minute or so. Finally, they both released each other as Floe backs away from her father slowly. I will make you proud of me, Father, Floe says as she places the hood of her white and red robe over her head and attaches the hammer to her belt. She begins to make her way towards Alistair, her body half turned so she can keep her eyes on her father.
You already have, Little Plum. You already have,
Denali says, his voice trailing off. He didn't leave the shore as he watched Floe get into the canoe, as Alistair pushes the canoe into the lake, only to quickly jump in after they were away from the shore. He could see them both paddling towards the mouth of the river until they vanished in the dense fog that covered all of Crescent Lake. It was then when a small tear ran down Denali's eye, as he removed his small spectacles while keeping his eyes out on the water. He took in a deep breath and looked around to see if anyone noticed his tears. Luckily, he was alone in the fog. Sadly, he was alone. He wiped the tear off his rosy cheek and started to make his way back to the dirt path leading back to his home. And this was a chapter of a novelization of Final Fantasy. This is my first time ever creating a fan fiction, and on top of that, this is the first time I've ever narrated one out loud. I'm still learning how to do this, and hopefully appeal to some of you. Give it a thumbs up, comment, subscribe, give me any criticism, good and bad, and I will try to get the next episode out as soon as possible. Thank you guys for stopping by. We'll see you next time.